Prime Minister's talking nonsense.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Hello, everybody. My sincerest greetings to all of you. Either you're watching us live now or you're watching us later via IGTV or on other video sharing platforms. On the 13th episode of I have the pleasure to host David Kitching. The issue of tonight is Brexit. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon or good evening in Dublin. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I was starting with an introduction. I was saying that tonight we're going to discuss the issue of Brexit with Mr. David Kitching from Dublin. He is the Managing Director of Baseline Strategy and International Research and Communications Consultancy. And we are very happy to have him here tonight. We're going to ask him a lot of questions to see the issue of Brexit from the lens of his perspective. We want to know what are the origins of Brexit, what is Brexit, and what will be the consequences for Britain, the EU, and the whole world. Thank you, David. You can start.
Great. I'm just trying to get this to stand up. Sorry, one sec. So, yes, thanks for inviting me, first of all. It's been a complicated 5 years, but also the last few weeks, even as we've seen the efforts to reach a final deal. It's one thing that's become really apparent is that the drive to leave the European Union within the UK has been going on for decades. And it's become increasingly apparent that it meant different things to different people. So you would think that by the time they came to a referendum in 2016, there would be some clarity as to what Brexit would actually mean. But this really was not the case. When it came to it, we had many different versions. During the campaign, the pro-leave side gave a very soft, light version of Brexit, that they said this would be the outcome, that the UK would stay within the single market and the customs union of the European Union, that there would be a healthy, stable trading relationship. But once the referendum actually happened, the conception and the interpretation of what Brexit actually means went from the vague to the extreme. So where you had the likes of Theresa May when she was Prime Minister saying things like they want a red, white and blue Brexit, whatever that means, to the point where you eventually had people saying no deal was better than a bad deal. And in the last few weeks, where it became so close and the level of brinkmanship that was on display really brought us quite close to a situation whereby there was almost no deal, and what ultimately emerged is so full of small caveats and so badly designed that ultimately it will involve a series of concessions from the British side if they want to advance anything in future. And from the EU's perspective, it's still not quite satisfactory, because the British government has shown itself to not really be a serious and reliable partner in negotiations. There was a very important component of the agreement, a clause called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was set up specifically to protect the mechanisms of the Good Friday Agreement, to maintain a North-South relationship. And while this was already agreed long in advance, within the last few months, the British government tried to unilaterally roll back on this through Westminster Parliament legislation. So it already left a sort of a situation whereby these were not trusted partners. There was not a trusting relationship between the two sides. So there is some damage done, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's still an awful lot more to do. And bear in mind also, this is happening in the context of a pandemic that's affecting all of us around the world, and the chaos this brings. So it's just it's been kind of strange because under normal circumstances, all of what's been happening around Brexit would have been headline news, in any normal time. And the pandemic has created both greater uncertainty and greater urgency, and also changed the way in which we talk about this. But ultimately, the damage is still there. It's just been maybe covered over by the more serious or more immediate dangers of COVID-19.
So you see that the negotiations in the course of negotiations between the EU and the UK, that has been the British side that has been unreliable and not moving in goodwill, yeah?
That's correct, yeah. And I know that within the British press, there have been efforts to portray the other side as being maybe obstinate or not particularly helpful. But again, it's worth bearing in mind the purpose of the EU's negotiating position was to limit damage. So, the EU is a project of complicated, sometimes imperfect institutions, but it's been a relatively successful project in terms of bringing together formerly 28, now 27 distinctive member states with their various interests, and the creation of this kind of mutualized organization, around social and civil rights, around currency, around political and environmental advancements. These are all things that needed to be protected from the EU's perspective. So ultimately, they wanted to establish a scenario whereby, for any other country thinking of leaving, they weren't going to give benefits to a non-member that they would give to a member, without protecting the freedoms and the resources that were shared by European countries. There was a serious concern in terms of how the UK conducted its negotiations also, agreeing to particular measures and then rolling back in them almost immediately, or not really cognizant of the idea that other EU member states read the British press. This is one of the asymmetries of the relationship, that an awful lot more people outside the UK speak English and read English than British people who read, say, French or German or Italian. So people were quite cognizant of what was going on in the British press and what was being told, in the Westminster Parliament. And it created, again, this atmosphere of distrust, but most particularly around that Northern Ireland Protocol, because people sometimes forget that the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement that brought an end to the Northern Ireland conflict, which went from the mid to late 60s until the late 90s. It was, again, all of these things they're imperfect and based around consensus, but it was a creative constitutional mechanism whereby you could have improved relations between the communities within Northern Ireland, then between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and between Ireland and the UK more broadly. So the North-South and East-West relationships were all the main pillars of this agreement. But people often forget that the European Union was a very important part of making that possible, because the European Union as a project, it diminished this kind of idea of hard borders as how you conceive of sovereignty. It replaced instead this idea of shared sovereignty. And when the UK and Ireland were both part of this same European Union, we were pooling sovereignty together. And so we didn't have the same Westphalian concept where sovereignty is absolute and it's all about, we have this amount of territory, you have that amount of territory. It was about shared responsibility, shared aims, and ultimately, peace became one of those key shared aims. So did the overall kind of economic mechanisms by which people could live better. And that was all made possible by the European Union. And there was severe concerns, particularly within the Irish nationalist community within Northern Ireland, surrounding the impact that Brexit could have on that relationship. So if there was a reinstallation of a hard border between the North and South, that this would automatically lead to the kind of conditions whereby conflict could potentially re-emerge, and also the economic impact which this would have. So yes, there were severe concerns that ultimately the British government were willing to play fast and loose with these hard-won gains for peace and for community relations. And also, historically, the British government's position within the Good Friday Agreement, since we reached that kind of point in 1998, has been to be disinterested as to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. And that means that if the populace of Northern Ireland decided to rejoin Ireland and to have reunification, that they would not stand in the way of this. The calculus around how Brexit came about in terms of negotiations that the British government had with political unionism, so people in Northern Ireland who wanted to remain in the UK, meant that they were relying on the Democratic Unionist Party for a time. And that meant that this kind of impartiality which they were supposed to have went by the wayside because they were relying on the Democratic Unionist Party for votes in the Westminster Parliament. So it all these kind of complications which further eroded trust, and then when you have certain totem issues like fishing or farming used as a means to maybe put pressure on other governments, it just left a bad taste. It made it difficult to have a kind of healthy relationship, which has historically been the case.
So you think that the UK is the one that will sustain more damage after the Brexit is implemented? Yes, is that your opinion?
In simple terms, yes. It's obviously there's no winner from Brexit either. You know, like the EU member states didn't want the UK to leave, or and there might have been some minority bodies of opinion that were maybe hostile to the UK, but this is very rare. Ultimately, it's a loss to the EU that the UK is leaving. From my experience when I was working in Brussels, British officials who were constructive and contributed to the European project were some of the best colleagues you could have. They're very good at driving a policy agenda, and very good at kind of moving things along where there was maybe stagnation or an impasse. So that is a loss, and there's no point in being in any way triumphalist if something goes wrong in the UK, because it's a loss for all of us. However, it will cause more damage to the UK because ultimately, in economic terms, there's very little to argue for Brexit. This is ultimately a culture war, wherein it was a victory of nationalism over economic interest, and the campaigning mechanisms used by the pro-Brexit brigade, I suppose, were dishonest. They made false promises. I suppose a lot of the problems that the pro-Brexit campaigners drew upon within the UK, kind of a level of alienation in the post-industrial areas, especially around the north of England and parts of Wales. A lot of the problems caused there were by domestic policy from the 80s, most particularly the deregulation of the labour and financial markets. But also a lack of investment in those areas. That was domestic policy, run from the Conservative Party at the time, as it happens. But they made false promises to these people and blamed the EU for these issues that had arisen, this kind of falling behind, and had done very little to ameliorate this. And what was telling was that when the UK was still a member of the EU, it had the highest level of regional inequality across the whole bloc. But this has played out differently within the UK. And so there was a level of dishonesty. So those areas, they were given a sense of false hope by Brexit campaigners, and it's not going to be fulfilled, that hope. In essence, also those parts of the economy that have done well out of EU membership will suffer greatly. So within manufacturing, obviously manufacturing has diminished in the UK over recent decades, but still areas such as the automotive industry will be severely damaged by Brexit. I know, Nissan, for example, has a large plant in Sunderland in the northeast of England. They've expressed serious concerns around the impact of Brexit, and it's not clear that they will stay. And they're a huge employer in that area, for example. If anything goes wrong in terms of subsequent agreements around trade, to the extent that it becomes uneconomical for major foreign direct investment companies to stay there, they'll just leave and move to somewhere else within the common market. In other areas such as agriculture, sheep farming, for example, within the UK, the vast majority of their exports go to the European Union, and that will be negatively impacted by this. But the largest component of the UK economy is service sectors. And we've already seen in large financial firms, tech companies, etc., many have already been relocating their headquarters to cities such as Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, and Frankfurt. And that was happening before Brexit. Some of them decided to bide their time and see what the results will be. So we can only imagine that more of them will eventually leave once the negative impacts do come to pass. And even in the last couple of weeks, we've already seen huge queues in the port of Dover as truckers are trying to make their way to Calais in France and into continental Europe. There have already been massive delays because of the administrative burden that's been placed upon exporters, simply because of Brexit. And we've seen some of the pro-Brexit politicians have said it's not so bad. People were talking about massive chaos. But we have to remember this is the first 2 weeks of January, which has historically always been a relatively quiet time for exporters. And it's also happening at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic, where efforts are being made to reduce travel. But they may seem temporary because the officials will be able to find a way around it, the issue of border administrative burdens and this kind of bureaucratic procedures that hard borders have with themselves. Yeah, but it's again, these are, I suppose, issues that they said would not arise with any kind of level of severity. But the reality is that they have already shown to be a significant headache for exporters in particular. And just the complications that have come within the overall agreement document that came in the last few weeks. I suppose there are so many unexpected problems down the line that will emerge. So there are contradictions within the document as to whether particular protocols are to be invoked or not. And it's evident that with any dispute mechanism or anything which might emerge, ultimately it's generally going to be the UK which will have to move for any kind of advancement. So ultimately, from a British perspective, this has not been any great victory. It's been presented as such within the pro-government press within the UK, and there have been efforts made to present it as such by the government itself. But ultimately, this has just caused untold damage, and it will continue to do so. I would make one proviso that the UK is not the only one going to suffer from this, and I suppose when I talked about the damage to the EU at a conceptual level, that is very true. In this kind of, as an example of a multilateral project, the EU doesn't like to see one of its major members leave. But aside from the UK, Ireland, where I'm talking to you from, will be the most damaged country by Brexit by the looks of things. Historically, our trading relationship with the UK has been huge ever since Ireland was part of the UK once upon a time. It's diminished in recent years, so the foreign direct investment companies in Ireland in the areas of pharmaceuticals, medtech and finance, they generally trade with continental Europe more than with the UK these days. But really, agribusiness and agriculture will be damaged by this relationship because the UK is still very much the main trading partner for agribusiness. So if you're to take also that regional impact, The major FDI companies in Ireland are in the cities, and often on the east coast, whereas the agribusiness sector tends to provide jobs within rural areas and within the small towns. So I can foresee a level of damage being done to small town Ireland by Brexit, and this will particularly affect the border region with Northern Ireland. It will also affect the north and the west and northwest and the Midlands region. And the difficult thing is, again, talking about COVID-19, these have also been the areas worst affected by the pandemic in economic terms, because they're the areas that rely on tourism as well as agribusiness. So there will be a detrimental effect in Ireland also from this, and there's no getting away from that.
Well, you refer to pro-government press in the UK. Can you name some of them?
Well, when I say I suppose they're pro-government when they want to be, when it suits them. But for example, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express have all been very much pro-Brexit organs of the press in any case. So it varies across broadcast media as to which kind of political orientation a particular journalist may have. But and I don't think it would be fair to name any person specifically on this broadcast. But the tabloid press, Rupert Murdoch's press, such as The Sun, they've been pro-Brexit outlets for many years, and ultimately it created this narrative within the UK that the EU was always a problem. And even the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, even going back to the time that he was a journalist, he was a correspondent within the Brussels press corps. And he made up many of the kind of stereotypes, many of the tropes that became a standard for Eurosceptic commentary. And ultimately, his political career was able to harness this many years later. These kind of ideas like the EU enforcing regulations on straight bananas, for example, which never actually happened, but it created an entertaining narrative that could be utilised by Eurosceptic commentators in the UK at the time, and ultimately benefited Mr. Johnson's career in his own right.
You touched upon areas of economy and industry which will suffer from Brexit. So can you put them in order to say this will be the worst hit sector of economy after the Brexit is fully implemented, then this will be the second? And another question is that how will London deal with this situation? What will, in your opinion, from your perspective, how they will manage these damages or consequences? How will they try to contain the repercussions and mitigate the level of damage? They of course, they expect some level of damage to occur. So what is your opinion?
Yeah, it's difficult to put things in a very clear order, but I would have to say the service sector is the most vulnerable. The UK is a predominantly service economy now, and absent from the single market, this creates issues in terms of access and in terms of even the VAT relationship. So take for example, in my own company, one of my main suppliers is based in the UK, and it's still not clear to me what the cost implications will be for me to remain using them. And if that level of uncertainty exists across the European Union when it comes to dealing with UK partners, ultimately, even if there isn't an onerous tariff burden, the administrative burden and the uncertainty will encourage customers to go elsewhere. And that ultimately damages the robustness and the health of the service economy within the UK. And we've already seen that with significant players in the banking sector and in tech relocating to other cities around Europe. So undoubtedly that would be the greatest damage. And when you ask, I don't think you meant specifically London in the city sense, did you, when you're asking that question? But the reality is that the City of London, as the financial district and Greater London, will be very much affected by this, because ultimately London has been the engine of the UK's economy, and that has been based on the service sector. So it will encourage many people to leave London. So that takes away the kind of vibrancy that a multicultural atmosphere like that brings. I've lived in London on 2 occasions, and it's a great place to work, and it's a great place to live and to study, and it ultimately it will lose out quite significantly from this kind of constant influx of people from many different countries, who now won't have the same economic attractions, but also a more hostile atmosphere has been cultivated by Brexit too. It has a cultural impact, which ultimately affects the economy too. Other areas which will be affected, which don't always get as much attention, but academia will be damaged by this. The UK has some of the best universities in the world, but these universities have benefited to a large degree from the European Commission's Horizon 2020 programs. So these are funding mechanisms for different research, development and innovation projects. And the likes of Oxford and Cambridge and Manchester University have all benefited massively from an influx of EU funding for collaborations with other research institutes and universities throughout Europe. It's created a great learning environment. It's attracted many students and academics and research staff to UK universities, and it's made them some of the best learning environments in the world. And again, the lack of that funding will reduce the opportunities available for staff, but also again the hostile cultural atmosphere will make it less attractive for students. So I studied in London for a year some time ago, and in the current context, I don't know if I would choose that again, even though it was one of the great experiences of my life to study there, and it was a wonderful place and a wonderful experience. But it changes the calculations people make. So the kind of young people who make a university interesting and dynamic and make a city or a town interesting and dynamic won't be attracted there anymore. So there is that kind of malaise that sets in when you remove that kind of stimulus from the university sector. The UK also decided to pull out of the Erasmus program, it's a student exchange program wherein you go abroad to study for a year in any other EU member state, and thousands upon thousands of UK students benefited from this program over the years, and this is now going to be taken from them. So it's removing opportunities from people too. And when you take opportunities from young people, ultimately they make different decisions, and it has a longer term implication for a country or a society.
And how do you think that London will handle these repercussions for its economy? You said that there will be many sectors in the British economy affected. What do you think will be the plans to mitigate the damages?
Yeah, this is it's a political question, really. So I was on my second time living in London. I was living there when the referendum happened, and I was working in a research agency, and I had access to a facility to run polls every so often, and so I could see that it was going towards a Brexit outcome several weeks before, but it was also very, very apparent that there was a division within British society. So, the young tended to favour remaining in the EU, older voters tended to favour leaving. But Londoners and Scottish voters tended to be very much in favour of remaining. And it was London was emphatically a pro-Remain city, because it has benefited so hugely from being an international centre, for being a centre of learning, of commerce, of culture, of all of the things that maintained London's status as this major world city. And it's been apparent in terms of the political calculus of the leadership of London. So Mayor Sadiq Khan, for example, he has been at pains to try and tell international people living in London that they were still welcome, So in spite of that kind of hostile environment that had been created by the national leadership, that London as a city would remain open and would remain welcoming. Now, that doesn't mean that London will not be affected by the national situation. It has to be, but there have been an awful lot of efforts made just to try and keep London as this kind of world city. It's still not going to be able to mitigate all of the damage, but the leadership will try.
Speaking of Scotland, do you think that there will be another referendum for independence? Will Scotland break away from the UK?
It's looking increasingly likely that the Scottish Nationalist Party in particular will push for a referendum. This has been, one of the major upshots of the Brexit experiment. It's really an experiment of English nationalism more than anything. It's shrouded in a discourse around British identity, but ultimately it's a cause of English nationalism. And it was maybe a bit short-sighted in terms of the implication that a UK exit from the EU would have on the unity of the United Kingdom overall. And while Scottish voters marginally voted to remain within the UK in the last referendum, such has been the discord and the dissatisfaction with the Westminster government's handling of negotiations with Brexit and this constant move towards a harder Brexit, move away from a coherent trade deal or from remaining in the customs union and the single market, that Scottish independence has been an increasingly attractive proposition for many Scottish voters. Ultimately, whenever they can get a referendum, I would find it hard to see them remaining within the UK. However, there are mitigating circumstances within that. It would be difficult for them to decouple Scotland from the currency union of the pound sterling. There would be other issues around military and security. An awful lot of the major nuclear installations that the Department of Defence has in the UK are located around Glasgow or nearby. So there will be issues around negotiating this and around the North Sea oil. All of these things that will affect that ultimate relationship. And we saw even with the recent negotiations between the UK and the EU that the focus on fisheries, it was quite remarkable because it's not a big portion of the UK's economy by any means. However, there was a recognition within London that if the UK failed on fisheries, they were definitely going to lose any kind of support in Scotland going forward. Because while Scotland was broadly, has been broadly pro-EU, broadly Europhile, there is a level of Euroscepticism within Scottish fishing communities because there's a perception that they lost out from EU membership because a certain amount of trading waters of fishing waters were traded for other kind of benefits when they joined the European Economic Community. So if they had lost a greater amount of the fishing waters, this would have been seen as very detrimental to Scottish fishing, and also to efforts to remain within the Union with England and Wales and Northern Ireland.
Let's say, would the British again vote for leave if a referendum were held now?
So it's always dangerous to talk about counterfactuals, Yasser. But I did have a look at some of the polling. There have been a few polls taken, well, quite regularly. A few different types of questions asked quite regularly since 2016, and there has been some fluctuation depending on other political contexts and goings on. However, at the moment, or the more recent polls have indicated that if the referendum were to happen again, that a majority would vote to remain in the European Union. Now, there's one caveat, which there was an interesting set of polls which slightly contradicted this. So, imagining that the UK has already left, which it has, would you vote to rejoin? Now, this was less clear, and there wasn't as much of an appetite to rejoin, and there's a much higher proportion of people who did not know their position on this. So this indicates it's not quite emphatic yet that they haven't had the UK has not had enough of an experience of being outside the EU to know whether it's worth rejoining. But given all that's transpired, if it were just the same situation as June 2016, a majority would vote to remain.
And let's shift to international relations. What will be the consequences of Brexit for transatlantic relations? How will the US, what does it mean for the US? What does Brexit mean for the US? What does it mean for US-EU relations, US-UK relations? Can you touch upon this area too?
Yeah, sure. So it means different things depending on which administration you're talking about. So, the US is in a transition period, and the Trump administration, this was not a multilaterally minded presidency. Trump was largely pro-Brexit. He saw that he was in favour of that kind of style of hard sovereignty nationalism. It reflected his worldview, and as a result, he was supportive. He would have been suspicious of the EU as a multilateral actor, and Trump is broadly hostile to this kind of rules-based liberal democratic order which the EU represents. So he was very much pro-Brexit and would have been quite favourable to a post-Brexit UK's position. Having said that, even though he had said he would want to have provide a good trade deal to the UK, there is a significant portion of Congress, even the outgoing Congress, who are hostile to that kind of idea if the UK did not adhere to the Northern Ireland Protocol of the exit agreement. So there's already a situation before the presidential election in the UK. Since November, obviously, we've seen that Joe Biden is now the president-elect, and Biden is much more multilaterally minded. It's far more his kind of worldview, and he'd be much more sympathetic to the European Union. Added to this, Biden is very vocal about his own Irish heritage. I don't want to overplay this as a kind of cultural link, but he does talk about it quite a bit. But he is very much attached to the success of the Good Friday Agreement as a peace agreement, and he's very cognizant of the role that the EU membership has played in maintaining the peace and in advancing kind of good community relations in Northern Ireland. So he has been quite emphatic for quite some time, even before the election, that there was no way the UK would have a trade agreement if the Northern Ireland Protocol was not adhered to. So that has been very emphatic. Added to this, Biden has also indicated he wants to sign up to or rejoin the Paris Climate Accords and other kind of mechanisms that have been advocated by the EU for some time. So we're looking at a more multilateral kind of orientation within the US, and this is much more in line with what the EU would desire than for maybe a more nationalist project like Brexit.
So you mean even after Brexit, London will align with the EU in its foreign affairs policy?
Well, London wouldn't have the... So do you mean London the city or London as the seat of government?
Will Brexit affect or undermine the EU's leverage in its international relations, in its foreign policy with growing blocs like BRICS, China, Russia? How do you see this from this perspective?
Yeah, so in economic terms, not so much. Now, again, the UK was one of the larger economies within the EU, so it is a loss. It would be better if the UK were still a part of the EU from the EU's perspective. However, the combined experience of what happened during the Trump presidency in the US and the experiment around Brexit, the last 5 years or so have really, I suppose, made a lot of actors within the EU maybe a little bit nervous about a potential breakdown of this kind of international rules-based order around trade and other things like this. And the EU has made efforts to be more active in autonomous terms when it comes to dealing with other third powers. So it hasn't been just acting as part of the West more broadly. So even just in the last few weeks, it signed an investment agreement with China. There are of course controversies around this as to whether it has been strong enough on issues such as human rights and labor rights and things like this, and the environment. However, it was seen as something of a statement that this was brought into being before the inauguration of President Biden in the US. But it's seen as a reaction also to the Trump administration's effort at stoking a trade war with China in the last few years. So the European Union is trying to shore up this kind of international trade led process of advancing prosperity. Again, there may be controversies within the bloc over how this is achieved, but it is something of a statement at least. And also, the idea that this investment agreement happened before the UK could go about establishing a stronger trade relationship independently is telling in itself. The government's leadership made it talked an awful lot about how it wanted to be a kind of buccaneering world trader, and it appealed an awful lot to kind of past maybe imperial and industrial glories, and ultimately hasn't really been able to achieve all of this since, because the reality is that when the UK was part of the EU as one trading bloc, trade negotiations were led from Brussels, and the best British trade negotiators tended to be employed by the European Commission. So the capacity wasn't always there in the first place. In addition to this, the political calculus changes with the change of the US administration too. So Brexit in itself, it doesn't benefit the EU as such, but it doesn't diminish its standing. It's still seen as a good and effective partner for third parties. One thing that I would say, now I'm no trade expert by any means, but just an observation, China's tendency has been to prefer simplicity in its trade relations. So a large bloc like the EU is much more beneficial from a Chinese trade point of view than a collection of smaller states. And this is maybe the opposite to the Trumpian worldview in the US, which prefers prefers bilateral relations with individual states, because in this case, the US would always be a dominant partner. But because of the nature of China's exports, it sometimes makes it easier to negotiate with a large bloc like this. So, if anything, it would be better for a country like China were the UK to remain within the EU.
The last question: when we look at the demographics of the referendum result, we see that younger people, college degree holders, or university goers were supporters of Remain campaign, and but on the other hand, there were old people who were voting for, or less educated people who voted for Leave. How do you explain this demographic of results?
Well, in many respects, younger people had seen the benefit of EU membership or the opportunities that would come from it. Like I said, the UK's economy changed a great deal from the 1970s to the present day. And where you had large industry and you had maybe a level of stability in certain sectors across the country, and this was hugely uprooted from the 80s onwards. And so many of those older voters would have been affected by this at the time, and it would have been maybe seen as a product of the forces of globalization and of of liberalization of the and deregulation of the financial markets and of the labor market. As such, it was easy to, in some quarters, to blame the EU because it was this external body that didn't always have the forum to defend itself when when accused of X, Y, or Z. And this narrative developed that the EU is a problem, even though, like I said earlier, in many cases it was domestic policy which brought an awful lot of these problems to the kind of post-industrial areas in the north of England. And there's a good deal of alienation within communities with high levels of unemployment, and an awful lot of the young people left those towns and moved to the larger cities, Manchester, London, Birmingham, moved in there, and there was an urban-rural divide. The larger cities tended to be more in favour of Remain also, and this kind of interaction of people from different places. As a younger person, you see the greater opportunities of moving abroad. Even something like the removal of Erasmus, this kind of great opportunity to go and see and live in another country for a while. Brexit ultimately has stolen from younger British people a huge amount of opportunities which they would have had, which young people in Ireland or France or Spain still retain. Brexit has taken this from them, and in a world where there are fewer certainties, the ability to be mobile and to access opportunities outside of your own shores is very important. So younger people recognise this because ultimately their survival depends on it and on having this kind of open society, whereas this might not have been the case for those older voters. And again, there was one very concerning concerning issue. So there was one demographic that had really been left behind in all of the kind of modelling and projections of elections for many, many years. And this was a cohort that was really zoned in upon by the Leave campaign. They were very successful in mobilising this, where the Remain campaign was not. And it just hadn't really been approached by any political party for many years. Such was the level of alienation. It's maybe a product of the electoral system in the UK also, that it causes this kind of bi-party polarisation, but where you have safe seats, people become less listened to. And as a product of many, many years of people not being listened to, when eventually something like a referendum comes along, it's a way to kick out and to demonstrate a level of protest at how things are handled overall. And there were a good deal of quite angry older voters who had frustrations built up over many years. And sometimes people are maybe unfair to some of the voters who favoured Brexit. It's maybe maybe there's a lack of empathy in it or something like this. But ultimately, people hadn't been spoken to. There was something unhealthy within the conduct of democracy within the UK for a number of years. And these problems emerge in other countries too, in different forms. We see the growth of the far right in other parts of Europe as people become frustrated and alienated. And it's not to excuse the kind of platforms that the far right runs on, but ultimately there is an onus on politicians within a democracy to reach out to people and to listen to them, and this didn't happen in the UK. And there is also an issue that the structure of a referendum, a referendum is a very blunt instrument, really. It just creates one binary, and the UK doesn't have a very strong history of running referendums. It had one to join the EU and to leave it, and had the independence referendum in Scotland. But there isn't really much experience of it beyond this. And as such, none of the kind of mitigating factors for polarisation were enacted with any great effect in terms of the discourse around this. So in recent years in Ireland, we've taken to using citizens' assemblies or constitutional conventions to talk through the issues of a referendum, to see where is the best place to kind of to have a discourse, and where do you draw the line as to what the question should be. And it's very helpful in terms of taking this blunt instrument and understanding better where the public is at. Where no effort was made at this in the UK. Ultimately, you had two sides maybe misinterpreting how to access their voter base, or misusing information, and in the case of the Leave campaign, often being quite disingenuous and dishonest and manipulating voters. And it was easier to do that in an atmosphere where the referendum worked solely on polarisation and division, and those divisions stay long after the result. So while those people who wanted to leave the EU for many years, they can be satisfied with their political career. They've achieved what they wanted, but ultimately they've left huge divisions behind. And the manner in which the referendum was won in terms of hostile discourse around immigration also, this has been hugely damaging. It's created a hostile situation for people who are not from the UK living there. And going back to what you say about the demographic distinction between the young and the old, younger voters were less scared of diversity, also, which I guess could have been a factor too. The pro-Brexit campaigners accused pro-Remain campaigners of Project Fear, but ultimately Brexit was won on the basis of anxiety and fear too.
Mm-hmm. Young people are open to changes, but old people are more traditional and conservative. It
seems to be the case, yeah.
It can be a factor.
Yeah.
Part of the explanation. Thank you very much. If there is nothing left, or if you don't want to have a concluding or closing remarks or such as, we can say goodbye.
Thank you, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. It was very informative. We learned a lot, insightful perspectives of yours. And I will share this video on my IGTV later. 24 hours later, I will share it on YouTube. And I'm sure more and more people will watch this video and will learn a lot. It was great to have you here tonight.
Great. Thanks, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody. For the next episodes of Dialogues, I will again inform you via the social media platforms that I'm in. But so far, we have made no arrangement. The future arrangements will be announced. Thank you. Good night.